All right, welcome back to DTR's YouTube channel. Before we get into this video, I just want to say if you guys like what you see, remember to like these videos, comment on these videos, subscribe to the channel, help the channel grow, make it worth the time to do these videos. I'm trying to help everyone out there learn a little bit about this kind of stuff from the real world type perspective, not the TV perspective. So to keep this alive and keep this going, like the videos, comment on the videos, share what you dislike or what have you. It's the only way this channel can grow. So let's get on to the video. Thanks. Okay, welcome back to the channel. We're going to continue working on our 442. We have our Outer Wheelhouse. I haven't even opened the box yet to see what this piece looks like. Hopefully it's not going to let me down. You saw in our previous videos cutting the quarters off and finding the rotted wheelhouses. Unfortunately, the right side is the only one that's available right now. So we're going to install it and finalize the installation of the right side quarter. So let's get started. So first thing we do, as I've said in the earlier videos about panel replacement, is to keep the car in its natural static position, meaning the car on its wheels, not on jack stands under the frame or what have you. This car is on wheel dollies in the front with the tires on it, and now we have jack stands under the rear, which again keeps the chassis in its natural static position, because you don't want to weld panels on if you have the car jacked and it has the frame tweaked in any way. So the wheel's off. I put the wheel studs back on, or not the wheel studs, the lug nuts on the wheel studs. Couple of reasons. When you're working on the wheelhouse, you won't jab yourself in the back or in the head by the edge of a wheel stud. The other thing is, when you're welding, you won't end up getting any weld splatter or anything on your threads. And if you put the lug nuts back on the wheel studs, you won't lose the lug nuts or kick them across the shop or whatever kind of dumb thing. So that's that. Now let's start talking about the actual panel replacement. Of course, we're not replacing this panel first, we're replacing the inner panel. But this panel needs to be lined up perfectly with the door If this was a full quarter, you would want to line it up with the trunk. I have the trunk lid on. Even though this isn't a full quarter, I leave the trunk lid on, again, to keep myself honest. When your welding panel's on, things can happen magically that you never thought would. Welding and creating heat can make steel move a lot more than you would think it would. So keeping all our panels on, we can maintain the alignment and know that once this is all in place, it's perfect. Gaps are going to stay right, and doors are going to close correctly and line up correctly. So when you're doing wherever the panel is that you're replacing, any adjoining panels you always want to try and keep on the car. The ones that, this one I can't, once this is on, you can't adjust it. You can adjust the trunk lid, you can adjust the door, but there again, if you do something to this that changes this, you may lose your adjustment and never be able to realign a panel to make it look correct again. So let's start with some things on this panel and what we want to do before we start thinking about the wheel liner. So before we can start removing the old wheelhouse, we want to make sure that our quarter panel is aligned, and we want to be able to take the quarter panel on and off and put it back in the same spot each time, so that we don't want to weld a panel on underneath and then not be able to get this panel back on and back where it belongs in the correct position. So what I do is I have these screws up in the front here, and I have one back here. So every time I take this panel on and off, when I put it back on, I just put these screws right back in the same existing holes, and this panel is going to be where it's going to be. You want to do this first. You want to create that constant, so that when you're trying to fit the inner panel and then putting the outer panel over the top of it, the inner panel is going to be going in the right spot, because the outer panel kind of controls where the inner panel goes. And we are going to be doing a partial replacement of the outer wheelhouse. So in some cases, when you're doing a full replacement of a panel, the panel kind of goes where it goes. But in this case, we're going to kind of have to hold its hand and let it know where it needs to be. But this panel is going to control where the inner panel goes. So just drill through some spots, put some self-drilling screws in the panel, and you can get it back in the same spot each time. And again, keeping the door on will also show that I'm lined up exactly where I need to be. Each time you need to double check yourself, because the panel is going to come off the car multiple times. So for now, I have 3 screws in it, and kind of thinking I might put maybe one more back here just to be sure, because the other thing too is taking these screws in and out over and over again, you can have a tendency to blow out the screw hole, and then the screw doesn't hold anymore. So a couple will maybe be better. And I only have a very small overlap on the top. I won't be able to put screws up on top on this edge. I have the one, but I just have it holding against, like pinching the panel on, but it's not holding it up there. So I'm going to put another hole in there, and then once we do that, I'm going to pull this panel off. Got our quarter panel off. When you're taking the quarter panel off that you put on, remember to take all the screws out. I forgot one. But now we have this off, and here is our crappy looking outer wheelhouse. Now, I said earlier we're going to be doing somewhat of a partial removal, because to take this panel completely off, all of this structure here would have to be opened up and disturbed, and in this case it's all very sound and very strong, and I don't normally want to disturb what is, you know, doesn't need to be disturbed. It's strong, it's holding together, and now you start opening this kind of stuff up, it's going to start moving other things you may not want to move. So I like to leave this kind of thing in place. So what we're going to end up doing is removing most of the flange down the back side, and then coming up and coming across the top of the liner and end up down here somewhere. But you would have to open all this up, open all this up. If this car was much more rotted and in need of that much more work, then doing all that extra stuff, or if the liner itself was rotted more, then you may want to do that. But in this case, I don't think it's necessary. And if I'm, yeah, just to get some of those spot welds out is going to be a big hassle in itself, and you're going to be prying and really disturbing all of this. All of this connects to your hinge area, and you start prying and wiggling this stuff all around, you can be causing all kinds of other problems, and you may not even see it happening again. And when you start welding things back together, is it going to go back to the same spot where it's supposed to be? So that's how we're going to do that. So the next thing I want to do is take a look at our new wheelhouse that I haven't looked at yet. Box is open. The customer must have looked at it. I haven't looked at it. And there you have it. Now, if this was a TV show, you would watch a couple Nike commercials and a couple Coca-Cola commercials. And after that, this would be installed. Or the whole car would be painted. But this is the real world. So, back to normal. What we're going to do is figure out how much of this panel I'm going to need and how much I can cut off, and we're going to start trimming and getting this laid over using our inner wheelhouse flange as our constant for getting this mounted to here, plus this part of the outer wheelhouse will go into this part and the rocker, and that will be another constant. So we got to get this back where this is and this back where this is. We're only going to be cutting it across here, probably across here and down back into the corner here. And because this existing wheelhouse is in the good shape it's in, fortunately, it's rusted out here where the quarter flange is, but up on top the metal is nice and solid. So another reason why we don't have to take the entire thing off, because there will be metal there to weld to. So I'm going to start ripping and tearing here and get these panels fit up. Now we're going to take a look at up close what we had just done. So back here we got our inner flange all cleaned off, missing some down here. So again, I'll put the outer wheelhouse on, and then once that's in place, I'll make this small repair, fabricate a panel and fill that in after the outer panel's on. Up here, you saw the cut I made. Now what's gonna happen is the new panel is I'm gonna test fit it to the point where it's laying up against here, get it in place, and then once it's in place correctly with the outer skin on, I'll scribe a line, and this will get butt welded as compared to this flanging method I'm using on the quarter. And then down here, I had to put my headlight on and take the action cam off so you couldn't see, but I got this, got a little bit left here I gotta grind off. And here again, I can already see that there's a little bit of rust under here, which I can address after the outer panel is on. But now my outer panel can go all the way down in. I can clean this dirt out of here, get some of that out. And now my new panel can fit down into here, up against here, and that's my starting point for getting the outer wheelhouse on. kind of looks like it's on, but it's not. So we got our alignment screws in. Instead of a screw down here, we just threw a clamp on it. This clamp is holding the liner down against the bottom of the rocker. Here's where we'll have to make a little repair in here. Close that off. Over here we're nice and tight up against the way it's supposed to be down here. But up here we got some problems. We got these two screws back in down here as well, but it's almost like the liner has to roll in to the car a little bit more. It's got to figure that part of it out, because the back part is where it belongs. So we're going to have to figure out what's keeping this out. Almost seems like the wheelhouse is almost down too low. And with these aftermarket panels, these kind of things these tolerances aren't always the greatest. So gonna have to tear this back off and make some further adjustments. I can probably get away with moving the liner up slightly. It's very flush. It seems like it's in the right spot. It's hard to say. But whatever the case, it's not on right. The back seems to be, might have a little bit of wiggle room there. See what happens. I'm going to continue doing some adjustments, and when I have it all in place, we will continue. Okay, so we're a little closer. I trimmed across the top of the wheelhouse to roll the quarter in. I'm against my back flange back here, right in here. That can't move any further. So it's a matter of cutting across the top. But now, let me show you. I'm closer than what I was, but I'm still not laying against the original panel. Like I got this. This shouldn't be stuck out like this. So what I'm going to do now, since I'm this close, instead of just trimming off a little at a time, I'm going to go in here and I'm going to scribe a line on my liner all the way around and get off all this, if I can show you this, all this excess metal that's overlapping one liner, all that metal right there. That's all the overlap. I don't need all that overlap, and that could be what's fighting me too. But you don't want to trim off too much too fast, which is why you saw earlier I was making multiple cuts to get this thing trimmed. You don't want to go and cut too much, because once it's off, it's off. So you go a little at a time. So I'll scribe that liner and leave myself about a half an inch of overlap or so, because I might be binding the liner against the existing steel under the quarter, which might be the reason why this is fighting me. So I'm going to take off all the excess that I don't need and get that out of the way, and hopefully that'll give me I'll be able to do my final fitment. And again, to remember, the liner and the quarter panel, those are for coupes, and I don't know myself if the liner is a different curve or something like that, compared, the replacement compared to what's on the car that I'm trying to marry to. So that could be what's giving me a little bit of this headache, getting this on exactly where it needs to be. But we're close, and these things do take time. I mean, this is, what day is it today? This is Monday, August 23rd, and just past lunchtime. I got about 3 hours into this now. And I've done lots of these jobs, and it just shows that it's not television, it's not magic, it doesn't just fall on. So I'm going to keep trimming, and we'll get there. All right, so now I'm at the point where I've trimmed back the liner. I have about maybe half inch, a little more than half inch of overlap going around the liner. Now, the diameter or the curve or the radius, whatever you want to call it, they're a little bit different. So welding these together is going to be a little bit tricky, but what you want to do is, the first place you want to weld is in your constant areas, which are going to be down here into where the wheelhouse goes into the rocker and attaches to the rocker on the outside, as well as inside where the liner or the wheelhouse is on the existing inner wheelhouse flange. The quarter panel is now laying against the original quarter without any bulges or oil canning effect. I have a couple screws back in. I have the screws that I started with all back in. It's clamped down here. This is where it needs to be. The door gap is nice, stayed consistent, hasn't changed, because reusing these same screw holes over and over and over again, the panel is going to go right back to where it originally was before I even started doing any of this. So we've got the two here. I ended up putting an extra one back in here to hold the panel in a little bit. I put an extra screw here to hold this against tight, and another the screw that was in here before, that's holding that against tight. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to fire some screws through the liner, the existing liner, into the replacement liner, and because now the liner is where it needs to be against the quarter panel. So if I took the quarter panel off and left the liner here, it may have a tendency to move a little bit. I have a clamp down at the bottom here, and I have a clamp on the inside of the trunk on the flange holding it in. But even with those two clamps, the panel could slightly, divert from where it's at. And when I take the quarter panel off, it may look like it's in the right spot, but if I start welding it and then put this back on, I may find out later that it's gone haywire. We don't want that. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to drive some screws around here, pinch the panels together, and then once I do that, then I'm going to start marking my outer wheelhouse to drill it and weld it to my constant areas, my flange and my rocker. After I have it welded in those spots, then I can start going around the liner, cutting through the panels to make one joint, and then solid welding that. So that's where we're at. Quarter panels on, backward. So we're all apart now. Put some weld through primer on the flange, down on this flange on the rocker. I've drilled my plug weld holes and punched holes in my flange to weld. What I'm going to do now is, with my screw holes, screw the panel back on so it goes back in place from where I took it off, from where the quarter panel was on and was on correctly. But before I weld this, I'm going to put my quarter panel back on, screw it back in place, make sure it's on right. Then I'll know that I can start to weld. It's worth the extra few minutes to put the panel back on so that, again, even with all these screw holes going back to where it was when I took it off, I'll probably be okay. And for all the times I've done this, I'm pretty confident I would be okay. But even to this day, to double check something, triple check something, what have you, it's worth the time to double check or triple check or quadruple check than it is to rush it and end up with a mess on your hand. So let's start by getting the wheelhouse screwed on, getting the quarter panel screwed on, and then we're going to start welding. Okay, so let's take a look at this real quick. We got a couple welds in there holding our bottom corner in. We got our flange welded on. Now what I'm going to do with my cutoff wheel is I'm going to cut right through both of these panels, making one seam to then stitch weld the rest of this on. Now I can do it a couple different ways. I could cut right here. I don't want to cut too far in here. I more or less want to cut some of this off. So basically I can cut maybe between the screws, and then once I cut through it, cut the excess off, clamp them together, and then start welding it in place. I'll probably end up throwing maybe another screw in here before I make the cut. Maybe not. But that's the next part. Let's get on with it. Okay, to give you an idea what I was talking about. So I clamped with my big clamps. Big clamps. Clamped the two panels together, and then I ended up cutting through the new panel first, then into the existing panel, and every so often putting a weld. So that side's all held together. One panel against the next. No panel over panel. Now I could go back, and what I can do is, now that this is kind of in place, I can use a hammer and dolly and get this just a little bit more flush this way. And then I got a little bit of a bubble here. The radius of this and the radius of this are different, and that is going to become a problem when I get into this area here. This has much higher of a crown to it than the panel underneath it, and when I start trying to pull them together, it's gonna go crazy. I may end up having to put a couple of relief cuts in this to get it to lay down, and there's probably, and there is, other ways of, you know, shrinking this panel to fit down onto that, but for what this is, the way I'm going to do it will serve its purpose fine, and you know, it you know, really won't make any difference. And to spend the time trying to shrink this would be a whole lot more time in overall. And it's, if this was a fender or an exterior panel, you know, you want to shape a panel to fit so you don't have a big Frankenstein looking piece. But in this case, that's kind of how it's going to end up, and that is a product of, I'm going to guess, because these are for a coupe as compared to a convertible. Cars can be different in that way, where those little insignificant things, like I said, the radius of this, and that might have to do with the way this opening is made for the convertible as compared to a coupe, but I'm not really sure. This is the first 442 I'm working on, so I really couldn't tell you what a coupe wheelhouse looks like. So instead of welding this all solid, I'm going to continue working this line and getting that tacked like this is, to get it, you know, all done all the way across. And once I have this all tacked, then I'll go back and I'll start solid welding the entire thing. But that's where we're at. All right, now we got it all welded in. I only had to do this one relief cut, and you can see possibly there's a little bit of wrinkles in here. Nothing worse than what you see in some factory panels. Now this area right here was really wrinkled up, but I used a air hammer with a planishing anvil to just work it out. This air hammer, and I just came in from the upside or from the inside and worked it and got this smoothed off. So we got her all welded down the flange. See on the inside, it's all solid welded. Now I'll probably end up burning some of this existing undercoating off when the body goes on the rotisserie. But I'll more than likely be re-undercoating the inside of the liner later on, because I'm not planning on stripping the entire underside of this car since it's in such good shape. But back to this, what I'll do next is all this metal that's all crusty and raw, and even this and the weld, even in here, I'm gonna put a coat of like black Rust-Oleum on all that, just to give it that little extra protection. I'll also, after I paint it, before I put the quarter panel on, I'll throw a bead of seam sealer over this weld, just to I paint the weld first, because the paint will get into any little pores or pinholes that might be there. That'll soak in real well, and then seam seal over that. And sometimes I'll even go back and paint over my seam sealer, because that just gives that extra bit of corrosion protection. So I'll get this cleaned up a little bit. I'll probably just wire brush a little bit of this off, maybe hit it with a rough scuff pad just to give it a little extra mechanical adhesion. Now this lock or plate for the striker is missing, not missing, but it's not staying on. I got to address that before I put this quarter panel on, but that's another day or another job. So here's our installed wheel liner. It's not too hard of a job, but as you noticed throughout the installation, it took a fair amount of tools to do the job. And that's where doing these kind of things on your own can also be a challenge because, excuse me, because not only do you have to have a good air supply to run your air tools, some people use electric tools, I don't really care for them, but you know, there's lots of different tools you end up needing, different hammers, different chisels, different pry bars, and you know, sometimes trying to do these kind of jobs yourself, you can buy the parts you need, but till you buy all the tools and such to do the job, plus, you know, having the welder and all that, that can make the job even more expensive. So in some cases, jobs like this, you know, just farm out to a quality restoration shop. I might know of one. But there we are. So I'll get this painted up and show you what it all looks like when it's all done, and then we'll move on. All right, so here we are. This phase of the project is finished. This is something that you don't generally see on your television style car programs. So I hope this will help you understand how to do this type of project if you choose to do this on your own, or just to understand that this is a big part of quarter panel replacement for anybody who has a car that needs quarter panels put on it. Most of the time when your quarter panels are rotted, a lot of times you're gonna find rot inside here. These areas are just collectors of garbage inside here, inside where your trunk drop is. Those areas over the years collect dirt. If your car sits for a while, that's where mice and such will have a tendency to build a home, and that's where, you know, moisture collects and so on and rusts these areas out, and then you have to do this type of project. So as you can also see, I coated everything with some rust paint to help preserve it all that much further. I went up underneath the quarter as best I could, inside the pillar. I fixed my striker plate that kept falling out. So that's all finished. So the next part of this project is going to be final installing the quarter skin. That's going to be in the next video. So to see that, as well as many others that we've put out, subscribe to the channel, comment what you might want to see, what you might be interested in. We're here to help you learn and share the different ins and outs of auto restoration that you don't normally see. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you learned something from it. And thanks for watching.